Okay, guys. So today we're going to continue working on the listening section, and we'll be starting the second part of the listening. We said in the listening section, you guys have 2 conversations and 3 lectures, right? So we've already seen the conversations. Let's start with the lectures. These are basically academic or university classes, So lectures basically are classes, university classes. They are 3 to 6 minutes long sometimes. Each lecture, remember, that contains 6 questions. Okay, guys? So you get 3 lectures. Each one is about 3 to 6 minutes long, and you get 6 questions per lecture. Okay, guys? Do you have any questions before we start with those lectures? Okay, guys. So these lectures basically will be in the lecture. First, you will have a short introduction where you will see the main topic of the lecture, the main topic. This introduction is about 30 to 45 seconds long. And it's really important that you pay attention to this introduction because it will give you an idea of what to expect for the entire lecture, which can be a little bit long sometimes. However, the most important thing for me to say, and the most important thing for you guys to do, is to understand the structure of the lecture, the style of the lecture. Because at the end of the day, these lectures are never going to be just one big idea. The lectures are always broken down into different ideas, to different subtopics. And these subtopics include facts and examples and theories and events and many other things and details. So there are some very common types of organizational styles that we're going to see. So let's see. Okay, so here it says, information can be presented in various ways, in different ways. Along with the type of text as shown on the previous slide, information is presented in an organizational style. It's important that you guys learn to identify and to classify the different organizational styles that we have. So for example, one very common organizational style is classification. In classification, basically the author talks about different categories of things, right? Different types of things. So for example, the author may introduce types of tropical plants, types of human behaviors, types of cloud formations, so types of something, sorts of something, or different categories of something. When you guys have classification, it's very common that you have the different types, the names of the different types, a brief explanation of what they are, and then examples. So for example, we have types of tropical plants. So we have the first type. Let's say it's called, I don't know, let's say fungus. Then you have a description of what fungus is, and then you have an example of that. It's very common to have something like that when you get classification. You also have comparison and contrast sometimes, where the author, or the professor in this case, looks at the different similarities and differences between things. For example, we can have a comparison between Roman and Greek gods, for example, between World War II and World War I. And in that case, you will have the similarities and the differences, when you have comparison or contrast. Those are just some. Then you also have sometimes problems and solutions. So for example, the author or the professor can talk about different ways to combat climate change, different solutions for climate change, or maybe different causes of climate change. Cause and effect is another very common one. You also have theory and support. So the author presents a theory, the professor presents a theory, and then it starts giving evidence or support for the theory. Then you also have cause and effect, as I was telling you. So the causes and the effects of something, maybe the effects of using antibiotics, the consequences of poverty, the causes of low self-esteem. So you have cause and effect as another big organization. Okay? So those are some, but of course there are more. And I just wanted to share that with you guys. It's important. I'm sorry. It's important that if you're listening to the lecture, you're able to be able to find it. Give me a second, please. I'm sorry. So as I was telling you, it's important that as soon as you're listening to the lecture, that you're able to identify what organizational style it has. Okay, guys? But let's say this with an example. That way you're gonna see better what I mean. All right, so let's take a look at a lecture. Okay, guys. So I'm gonna start by playing the introduction of this lecture, just the introduction. And I just want you guys to hear. I don't want you to do anything else. Don't take any notes. I just want you to pay attention to how the introduction works. And then we'll be discussing what we have. Okay? So let's see.
Listen to part of a university lecture by a professor in the College of Fine Arts. Good morning, everyone. Today I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective. First, we'll look very briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. Just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects on the two dimensions of their canvas. There are two basic sorts of visual perspective: aerial perspective and linear perspective. Aerial perspective, and aerial just means air or atmospheric, not your view from an airplane. Aerial perspective is the way that the atmosphere affects how we see things, especially distant things. I won't try to go into the laws of physics that are involved here, but it is aerial perspective that makes a mountain in the distance appear to be a different color, that makes it seem hazier, less distinct than closer objects. These are effects that realistic artists attempt to reproduce carefully and that impressionists use to create their own effects. Just think of many of Turner's landscapes or cityscapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see. Another perspective, linear perspective, is the way that things seem to get smaller the farther away they get.
Okay, guys, let's stop there. So just to see the first part, we're gonna see the transcript. Of course, that when you're actually in the test, you can't do that. You can't see the transcript. But I just want to show you a couple of things. So in the beginning, we have the introduction, where the professor talks about the topic, as I told you, right? The professor always introduces the topic first. The professor says, today I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective, right? So that is the topic. That's when you know what the lecture will be about. But then if you take a look at what comes next, the professor also says, first, we look very briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we look very quickly at its history in art. So just by hearing that, you guys should already know the organizational style that this lecture will have. Because when the professor says that they're going to first look at the kinds of perspective, that means classification, right? And if you know that it's classification, then you're going to be paying attention for the different types of perspective and its examples, their definitions and their examples. And then when the professor says it's history in art, then you know that's going to be sequence of events. So probably you're going to try to pay attention for the origin of perspective, who developed the first theories of perspective, how it was spread, how the world was before perspective. So you're looking at historical notes, right? So sequence of events, what happened first, what happened later, what happened at the end. So that is already telling you what to look for in the lecture. When you're listening, you're not a passive listener anymore. You become an active listener and you start looking for those things, those elements. Okay, guys, that's the structure. And then you get a short definition, a short explanation on the topic. It says, just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is, and then you have a brief definition of the topic. Okay, guys, that's the introduction. Is that okay so far? Do you have any questions? Okay. Now, another thing that I want you guys to notice is how the lectures, if you see the transcripts, they are not just one big paragraph, right? It's not just one big paragraph. You have a lot of paragraphs because each paragraph talks about one thing, talks about one unity, is a unity, focuses on only one idea. Ideas are not mixed here. So for example, after the introduction, we have this first paragraph that talks about the first type of visual perspective, which is called aerial perspective. And as I was telling you, when you have classification, you normally have a brief explanation of that. So what aerial perspective is, and then you have examples of aerial perspective, right? And then you have the other type of perspective. You have the same. You have a short definition, and then you have examples. And then they start talking about other things, okay? But what I want you guys to do is I want you to identify and to be able to notice when the professor ends an idea and starts a new one, because that's going to be key for the way that you take your notes. I don't know if you guys noticed, but let's say if we play this part again.
Escapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see. Another perspective, linear perspective, is the way that things seem to get.
I don't know if you guys noticed, but there was a small pause in between the two ideas, right? When the professor was finishing this paragraph, how their air can affect what we see. The professor lowers his voice a little bit, makes a pause, and then raises his voice again to start with the next idea, right? Another perspective, linear perspective is, so you guys need to be able to identify those pauses, identify when the professor starts and finishes an idea, because that's going to be key for your note taking. Okay, guys? Because as I told you, everything is going to be organized in different unities, in different paragraphs, if you see the transcript. So that means that there are going to be more than just one idea. It's not going to be one entire big thing. Okay, guys? Now, any questions so far?
Miss, let's suppose that we have to catch up all the ideas of every paragraph.
I mean, not necessarily. You can skip, it's okay if you miss some details, but you at least should understand what each paragraph was about. So when you're listening, what ideas the professor discusses, and a brief understanding of what each one is about, like a general understanding. Now, there are going to be a couple of detailed questions, but they're always going to try to measure your your understanding in general. They won't ask you for specific things.
Okay, so there isn't like, I don't know, what is the age or what is the name of one art, for example? So it's
No.
only to catch the ideas, the general
Yes.
idea of every paragraph.
Yes, the questions, for example, are going to be like, why does the professor mention, and then they could say, why does the professor mention this painting, let's say, and you have to be able to say why, where the professor mentioned that. Maybe the professor used it as an example or of a specific type. Maybe the professor used it to explain an idea. So it's most of the questions are going to try to measure your overall understanding. But there are going to be a couple of details, mostly related to the examples, but you won't have like names or dates, things like that.
Okay, mistakes.
Yeah. Or any other question? Okay, guys. So what I want you to do is when you guys take your notes, it doesn't matter if you're taking the test at home or in a test center, because remember that the way you take your notes is different, right? If you take your notes, if you're taking the test in a test center, you just use normal paper. But if you're taking the test at home, then you need a whiteboard or a transparent sheet with a paper inside. But it doesn't matter where you're taking the test. What I want you guys to do for these lectures of the listening part is, first of all, use your paper or your whiteboard in a horizontal way. Okay, so it has to be like this. It can actually be like this, vertical, right? You have to use it like this. And second, what you guys need to do is divide your paper into 9 different boxes. You can do that by drawing. I'm gonna draw 4 lines, parallel lines. Obviously, it doesn't matter if they're not perfect, but something like this. I don't know if you guys can see, if everybody can see on my video. So you have your paper and you have 9 different boxes. And that's what you guys have to do. Divide your paper in 9 different boxes. Now, why are you going to do this? You're gonna take your notes in this way. You're gonna start here. This is gonna be the first box. And then you're gonna go like this if you want, or you could go like this, I don't know. But the important thing is that you go from left to right, okay? And horizontally, not vertically. And what you guys need to do is in every box, you're gonna take your notes from one different idea. That means for one different paragraph. So for example, in your first box here, you could write down your notes for the introduction. So you maybe write down the topic and the definition that you have. You don't obviously have to write everything down, just a couple of details that maybe you don't think you would normally remember. Maybe I would only write down the name of the topic, to be honest. And then you go to the next subtopic, right? Which in this case was aerial perspective, the first type of perspective. So you can write down aerial perspective because that's something that maybe it's not that easy to remember. Then when they are explaining what aerial perspective is, you shouldn't be taking notes. You should be paying attention to and trying to understand to make it make sense, right? Trying to see what aerial perspective actually is, because sometimes when you're too focused on taking notes, you miss the most important ideas. So when they are explaining big ideas, like for example, definitions or concepts or explanations, you're not taking notes, you're paying attention. So your aerial perspective, you pay attention, you try to understand what it is. And then when they start mentioning examples, you start writing down the examples, because those are things that are not that easy to remember. If you have specific names of paintings, specific details, you write them down in your notes. You do the same for the second and for every other idea that you identify. Of course, this requires a lot of practice. Initially, you guys won't be able to identify every single idea and differentiate them like completely 100%. But as you go, you're gonna be better at identifying the ideas and separating them, okay? But this is a really good guide because it allows you to use just a limited amount of space per idea. So if you have already used all the space that you had in one box, that means that chances are it's the next idea already. So you have to move on to the next box. Okay, guys, it's important that you try to do this at least. You don't necessarily have to do it in this way at the end, but I really recommend that you give it a shot, that you try, and that you see if it works or not for you. This is something that worked for me like very well. To be honest, I think that's what made the big difference. But everybody works in different ways. But I will suggest that at least for today and tomorrow's class, you try to do it like this. Okay, guys, so that you try that. Is that okay? Do you guys have any questions now?
It's okay.
Okay, guys. So, and another way that this is going to help you is because, for example, let's say that you have here aerial perspective. This is aerial perspective, and you have the examples of aerial perspective. So an example of aerial perspective was a cube. So you have that there. Now, when they ask you, why does the professor talk about cubes? Then just by knowing where that information is, you know that cubes is here in the box that corresponds to aerial perspective. Then you know that it's gonna be to say something about aerial perspective. But if you take your notes like vertically, then you're gonna have everything here and you're not gonna be able to separate the ideas, right? You won't know what idea corresponds where, or what detail corresponds to what idea. So that's what I would suggest, that you start doing it like this. Okay, guys? So no questions really. We're gonna now listen to the entire lecture. I want you to take notes. And in this way, so please get a piece of paper, divide it into 9 different boxes, the way that I did. And let me know when you're ready so that I can play the lecture. Guys, can I play the lecture?
Yeah, Miss. Yeah.
Okay.
Listen to part of a university lecture by a professor in the College of Fine Arts. Good morning, everyone. Today I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective. First, we'll look very briefly at the kinds of perspective, and then we'll look very quickly at its history in art. Just in case you don't know what we're discussing, perspective in art is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects on the 2 dimensions of their canvas. There are 2 basic sorts of visual perspective: aerial perspective and linear perspective. Aerial perspective, and aerial just means air or atmospheric, not your view from an airplane. Aerial perspective is the way that the atmosphere affects how we see things, especially distant things. I won't try to go into the laws of physics that are involved here, but it is aerial perspective that makes a mountain in the distance appear to be a different color, that makes it seem hazier, less distinct than closer objects. These are effects that realistic artists attempt to reproduce carefully and that impressionists use to create their own effects. Just think of many of Turner's landscapes or cityscapes like his Ditto building Carthage to get an idea of how the air can affect what we see. Another perspective, linear perspective, is the way that things seem to get smaller the farther away they get. A classic example of this is the way we perceive railroad tracks or a line of telephone poles running away from us. They seem to get smaller and smaller as they recede, until they vanish in a point on the horizon. And this point is appropriately called the vanishing point. This effect happens whenever there are parallel lines like the two train tracks or the tops and bottoms of the telephone poles. Now, an object or a scene may have more than one vanishing point. A cube, with one of its faces squarely perpendicular to us, has a single vanishing point, directly behind it and on the horizon. But a cube with one of its vertical edges facing us has two vanishing points instead, one for the right-hand face and one for the left-hand face. And these points are off to the right and left respectively, on the horizon, where the parallel lines of the faces seem to converge. And then, if this same cube is viewed from somewhat above or below, it will have three vanishing points, one to the right, one to the left, and a third one behind it and below or above the horizon. This is easy to visualize if you look up at a corner building from its street intersection. You can look down one street to see the right-hand vanishing point, look down the cross street to see the left-hand vanishing point, and then look up along the corner of the building to visualize the third vanishing point. These kinds of perspective are easy to see if we view geometrical shapes or man-made structures. But of course, natural scenes don't have any sets of parallel lines, so they have no vanishing points. But that doesn't mean that they don't exhibit perspective. The laws of optics were not understood at all in early Western art. Artists recognized the effect, of course, but they were unable to figure out how to represent it accurately. From the paintings inside the Egyptian pyramids to the illustrations in medieval Christian churches, nearer people were simply drawn larger, or drawn lower in the picture, or drawn so as to cover the people farther away. There was no real understanding of how the physics of perception worked. They never got a grasp on the idea of the vanishing point. And then came the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and the sciences. This was a hotbed of scientific thought. Da Vinci, Galileo, Newton, and Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi was a 15th century Florentine architect who conducted several optical experiments and discovered the rules of perspective. With what he learned, he drew a very accurate picture of San Giovanni Baptistry in Florence, and then he made a small peephole in the middle of it. He carried it into the street and amazed all his acquaintances by having them look through the peephole from the back of his picture. First, at a mirror which reflected the image into the viewer's line of sight. Then, Brunelleschi would quickly withdraw the mirror, leaving the viewer peeping at the real baptistry, whose perspective had been replicated perfectly. Other Italian artists, notably Donatello, began using Brunelleschi's methods for accurate linear perspective, and his ideas soon spread throughout Europe. The development of effective aerial perspective, on the other hand, was developed by the Flemish and Dutch masters of this same period, and can be seen at its best in works like Jan van Eyck's The Virgin of Chancellor Roland. But that's another story.
Okay, guys. So that was the lecture. As you can see, it's a little bit long, 5.5 minutes. And it contained a lot of details. Sometimes there are different things that students struggle with. Some students struggle with vocabulary, academic vocabulary. Other students struggle with maybe with the speed. If you think that it was too fast, maybe what you can do is practice at different speeds, listening to different content at different speeds, start slower, and then little by little start increasing the speed. Other students struggle with the length of the lecture, because I know it's too long and sometimes you're paying attention and everything's fine until halfway through, but then when it's getting close to the end, then you lose focus and then it's hard to understand. In that case, you can maybe work with different lectures of different lengths. Start with shorter lectures and then continue increasing the length of the lectures. Other students struggle with note-taking. That's usually a big problem for many students. If that's your case, then just is practice again. So listen to different types of content, faster lectures, and try to take your notes. I mean, the best way you can, and start taking notes again gradually. Everything has to be gradually, step by step. So start by just writing down the big ideas, the subtopics, aerial perspective, linear perspective, vanishing points, everything, all that you're gonna write is down. And then little by little, you start taking more notes. So one line, one sentence for each, let's say. And that way you go increasing and increasing the level of your notes. So I think it depends. If you struggle with vocabulary, then it's gonna be a big problem unless you expand your vocabulary, your academic vocabulary. So what do you guys think? What was the most difficult part? Or what comments do you have?
For me, I think that it's the note taking. I think that the lecture gives a lot of ideas. When you are taking one note or one idea, probably the audio is to next idea.
Yes, sometimes it happens. So if that's your problem, then practice as I was saying before. Start by just taking one line of notes for every subtopic. So just as long as you understand what the subtopics are, you're okay. And focus on understanding. Then little by little start taking more and more notes until you create a balance between understanding and also taking notes. Gradually.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, guys. Any other comment? Okay, so let's take a look at the questions. Our first question says, what is this lecture mainly about? It's the main idea question. What option would you guys choose?
A historical evolution would be.
Okay. What do you guys agree?
Maybe B or C.
Guys, so if you didn't have the options and I asked you, what was the lecture about? What would you say?
Fine art
About,
and visual perspectives.
yes, about a lot of perspective, a lot of kind of art.
Visual perspective in art, right? That's the topic, and the professor said it in the beginning. So you have to find the one that is closest to that. So it is true, for example, that the professor talks about the historical evolution of visual perspective in art, right? The professor talks about the first theories of perspective, who created perspective, who created area linear perspective, how it spread, how early or how the ancients did it or didn't know the laws of perspective. So that's true, but is it what everything is about, is mainly about? The lecture was mainly about visual perspective. It's true that a historical note was mentioned, but that's not all, that's not the main idea. The main idea is just visual perspective, because we have the types, we have the definition of visual perspective, and we have the history. So in general, it's just visual perspective. Now, for example, somebody was saying B and C. As for option C, this is very tricky and very tempting as well, because it does contain a synonym. It contains the word viewpoint. Viewpoint is a synonym of perspective, but it's not applied in the same context, because viewpoint is a synonym of perspective as in opinion. Like my viewpoint, my perspective, my opinion is, and then I can give my opinion about something. But we had visual perspective not referring to opinions, but to visual perspective, right? It's not the same. So an artistic viewpoint basically means the opinion of an artist, una opinión artística. But it wasn't about any opinions, right? Not one opinion was mentioned. So yes, visual perspective, in the way that the professor defined it, is an optical effect. And that's why I told you to always pay attention for the big ideas. Like, for example, in the introduction, the professor says, today I want to start with a look at perspective, visual perspective. I would only write down visual perspective, and that's it. And then I would pay attention. So what is visual perspective? Visual perspective is the way that artists represent three-dimensional objects onto the two-dimension of their canvas. So that is visual perspective, when an artist represents something that is 3D on a 2D canvas. So what is that? That's an optical effect, right? It's representing 3D objects on 2D canvases. It's an optical effect, because when you see, and again, this is just a big idea, because if you understood what visual perspective is, you know that it's that when you see a painting or when you see a drawing, even though obviously it's just a drawing, it's 2D, you're able to have a sense of how the perspective is. So if, let's say, it's a group of people, just by seeing the painting, if it's correctly done, then you can see who is closer to you and who is far, far away. So you can analyze those things. So those are optical effects, right? Well done. It's not an interesting observation either, because the professor doesn't observe anything. It's just a visual perspective, which is an optical effect. Is this okay so far? Okay, guys, next question says, which is a characteristic of realistic landscape paintings? What do you guys think?
Letter C.
Okay. Yes, do you guys agree?
Yes, letter C.
All right, yes, perfect. Because these realistic landscape paintings were used to give examples of aerial perspective. And if you guys understand what aerial perspective is, then you know that aerial perspective is related to air, right? To the atmosphere. So yes, they show atmospheric effects. Vanishing points was mentioned later when they were talking about vanishing points. And clear from a distance, distances were mentioned are related to linear perspective, right? If you understood the big ideas, then you know that. And the Renaissance art, or they appear in the Renaissance, that is when they were talking about the history, right? But really, realistic landscape paintings were examples of air perspective. Well done. Now, a third question says, why does the professor mention Turner's painting, The Ditto Building Cat? What do you guys think? If you don't know, take a guess.
Maybe D.
as an example of multiple vanishing points? I don't know, to be honest. I don't think so. I think this was mentioned towards the beginning of the lecture. So I would say probably an example of aerial or maybe linear perspective, but I wouldn't say vanishing points. But let's see. Now, question 4 says, according to the professor, why was the Renaissance conducive to art? What would you guys say? Why was the Renaissance conducive to art? It's a big idea, right? It's not such a specific detail. What would you say?
Letter B.
Letter D, it permitted the Dutch masters to
No,
develop.
B.
Oh, it opened the classics to European thought. Okay, are you sure? European thought?
I don't know. They mentioned Europe, but I don't guess.
I mean, they say that the Renaissance was the time where like science was mixed with art, right? So I think it's A, it created an atmosphere of scientific curiosity. They talked about scientific thought, but they didn't talk about the classics or European thought. I think it's opened the classics to scientific thought, not European thought. I don't know. Let's choose B. Let's see what happens at the end. We'll see. And finally, we have foreshortening is a way of representing an object so that it conveys the illusion of depth. And its success often depends upon a point of view in which the sizes of near and far parts of an object contrast greatly. Foreshortening is an instance of what? What do you think?
That is linear.
Linear perspective, yes. Do you guys agree?
Yes, option D.
Okay, good. Yes, linear perspective is related to that, right? To distances, to depth, to sizes of near and far parts of an object. So yeah. Let's check. And we're also going to see a transcript. So the first one's correct. An optical effect is the closest one to visual perspective. Now, realistic landscape paintings do show atmospheric effects because it's an example of aerial perspective. Now, as for the reason why the professor mentioned Turner's painting The Ditto Building was an example of aerial perspective, actually. we take a look at the transcript. When the professor was talking about aerial perspective, that's where the professor talks about this data build, right? To get an idea of how the air can affect what we see. So it's related to aerial perspective. And then they started talking about linear perspective. So this should be in your notes related to aerial perspective, in your box that is about aerial perspective. Now then we have, according to the professor, why was the Renaissance conducive to art? So yes, it created an atmosphere of scientific curiosity. When they started talking about the Renaissance here, the rebirth of learning and the sciences. This was a hotbed of scientific thought. Da Vinci, Galileo, Newton, and Filippo Brunelleschi. So basically, it was a hotbed of scientific thought, right? Was the rebirth of scientific thought. They didn't talk about the classics or European thought. And finally, question 5 is okay, is fine. Foreshortening would be an instance of linear perspective, because when they were talking about linear perspective, that's why they say, right? Linear perspective is the way that things seem to get smaller the farther away they get. So it has to be, it's related to depth and to sizes of things, right? So as you can see, they are not very like specific details, you know, they're not asking you something like who developed the first theory of perspective, you know? So take advantage of that. It's about understanding the most important, the big ideas, and creating a balance between your note-taking and your understanding of ideas. So what do you guys think now? Any questions?
Yes. In which order will appear the lectures and the conversations? They are random or it have a specific order?
Oh, okay, good question. You have one conversation and then 2 lectures, then another conversation and other 2 lectures.
Okay.
So it's in total 2 conversations and no, actually it's 1 conversation, then 2 lectures, and then 1 conversation and 1 lecture. Because it's 2 and 3. So yes. Any other question?
So in the lecture questions, is in order also or is random?
What do you mean? What is in order?
In order to the discussion. So the first
Most,
question is about the introduction, the second question is about the first paragraph.
yes, generally speaking, they go in order, but not always. Like in this case, for example, linear perspective, a question about linear perspective was at the end. So that could happen sometimes, but as if you notice, most of the other questions, all of the other questions were in the same order, right? They start with error perspective, then they talk about vanishing points, and then the one question for the history in art, right? The first one was about areas, then we had vanishing points, and then the Renaissance. And then at the end, we had that question about foreshortening. But if you think about it, that question about foreshortening, this is something that wasn't mentioned in the text, right? They didn't mention anything related to this. So it's trying to measure like your understanding of the entire lecture to see if you understood everything that's here. You know, what aerial perspective is, what linear perspective is, vanishing points, and this Brunelleschi's demonstration. So this question, even though it's related to linear perspective, what the question is trying to do is measure your understanding of everything, of the big ideas. Because it's something new, something that wasn't mentioned. You know, this wasn't mentioned. But the other questions go in order, if you notice. And most of the time they will go in order. And that's another really good thing, because sometimes you don't know. Let's say that you didn't know the answer to the first question. It is more likely that option C is the most likely to be the one. Just following the order, because you know that you had aerial first. So probably the question that appears after the main idea is gonna be related to the first topic, probably. Obviously, we're not 100% sure, but if you had to guess, then yes, try to guess according to the order of the information. It's very unlikely that this was about vanishing points or the Renaissance art. To me, this is the most likely to be the one. Then you have this option as the second, and then the other ones are not likely to be correct. Okay, so yes, actually, that's a great question. And any other question?
Yes, it is probably that, for example, aerial perspective was the response in 2 questions.
Yes, it can happen. Obviously, it's not very common. Most of the time, you only get one question per subtopic. And there are some topic where you don't get not even one question because you have 6 or 5 questions. And the first one is always going to be the main idea. So what happens is there are going to be some ideas that don't have a question. And it's very unlikely, but it could happen that you have more than one question. So again, if you had to guess, then the most likely thing, the most chances are that you only have one question per idea. So if you know that the answer to this question is atmospheric effects, aerial perspective, and you had to guess the second one, then this is the less likely to be the one if you had to guess.
Okay.
So, yes. Any other question? Okay, guys. So aside from Magoosh, if you guys want to practice the full lectures, and I would recommend this website. I'm gonna send you guys the link. It's a really good website for practicing the listening and other things as well. You can find a lot of material here if you check it out. But it has a lot of lectures. I think it's about 40 lectures that you get, and everyone is on a different topic. So that's a great thing because sometimes you notice that maybe you're not good in history. So that can allow you to work on only history questions. Sometimes you notice that you're not good with science. So you practice only science topics. So it's good in that way. And it's also good because it has a transcript. And I have noticed that the questions are similar to the questions in the real test. Because sometimes there are other websites that don't have questions that are similar. Another very important thing. Guys, is that okay?
Yes.
Any questions? Okay, guys. So tomorrow we're going to be practicing this part of the listening. We've already practiced conversations. Tomorrow we'll practice lectures. And please, before you go though, don't forget today's daily survey. It should be on your screens. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Then I will see you tomorrow.
See you
Bye.
tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye.